It's owing to the fact that energy can only flow in accordance with rules. In purely physical processes like a burning fire, the rules are those of physics and chemistry, what are called physical laws. But any dissipative structure is the same in this respect. It dissipates energy from exergy into heat, and it does so in a manner that conforms to the laws that govern its nature. Rules give us complexity. In 1970, mathematician John Conway introduced what he called his game of life. It had nothing to do with the Milton Bradley game of the same name. This was an example of a type of mathematical model called cellular automata. It consists of a board laid out on a square grid. One is to imagine that this grid extends indefinitely far in all directions. The squares are called cells, and they may be either empty or colored in. In the simplest version, there's only one color, and a cell that is colored is said to be alive, and one that is empty is said to be dead. The rules are simple. If a dead cell has exactly 3 live neighbors among its 8 adjacent squares, then it comes alive in the next turn. A live cell with 2 or 3 neighbors stays alive. A live cell with more than 3 or fewer than 2 neighbors dies. In the example shown up here is a pattern that repeats itself every 4 turns, but which shifts down and to the right as it does so. This is called a walker, because it just kind of moves along across the thing over and over and over, repeating the same pattern. A pattern like this in Conway's game of life is a dissipative structure. In order for cells to change at each turn, calculations must be made and the board updated. This costs exergy. In the case of this particular example, it's in the form of electricity flowing through circuits. No electricity, no gain. But the reason it's interesting for this discussion is because it illustrates beautifully how complexity arises in dissipative structures. Start off any board with a few randomly colored squares and let it run. And there's no knowing what you might end up with. Most of the time, it doesn't do much. The cells either all die or fall into some repeating pattern. But occasionally, something curious happens. Sometimes, very intricate patterns are created. Sometimes these patterns grow, or move about while maintaining their structure, or even reproduce themselves, or procreate other patterns that in turn have interesting properties. In this brief looping animation here, the little white specks are the live cells on a grid that's almost too small to see, and the patterns are produced as several dozen turns are calculated in the space of a second or so. Recently, it was learned that a programmable computer can be made as a game of life pattern, and indeed there appears to be no limit to the complexity of systems that can arise, all from the bare handful of rules that govern how energy is expressed as it flows through the structure. Watching the patterns emerge gives one the uncanny sense of something actually alive. It should be noted that the amount of exergy required to produce the patterns is not constant. Efficiently programmed, any given instantiation of the game of life makes only as many calculations as are required for each turn. A pattern that grows in size and varies continuously will require an ever greater number of calculations at each stage. These calculations cost exergy. The circuitry of the computer will actually draw more electricity and create more heat in consequence. This is a theme we'll have cause to revisit. One more note, the large and complex patterns that are sometimes created are almost always exceedingly fragile. Introduce a few live cells in the midst of such a pattern, and it will usually fall into pieces, consumed as if by a destroying fire of random interactions. The vulnerability and fragility of homeostasis is another theme that this echo follows. So we've noted the following commonalities. All dissipative structures consume energy, transforming useful energy, what we've called exergy, into less useful energy, heat, basically. All dissipative structures give rise to complexity. That is, they're self-organizing as an emergent property of the way their inherent rules channel their energy flows. To these principles, we should now add a third. It's been noted that even the universe itself, considered as a dissipative structure, will not go on forever. Eventually, it will suffer heat death, at which point there'll be no remaining structure or complexity of any kind. It follows that no dissipative structure is immortal. The first risk to any dissipative structure is variation in its flux of energy. Of course, if the fuel dries up, it's done for, but we'll see that for highly complex structures, it may be enough just for the flux to vary too much to cause a loss of homeostasis. But there are other dangers. Like a match in the wind, every dissipative structure has an external environment that can act upon it. And these actions can produce crises that also threaten homeostasis. The more complex the structure, the more different kinds of crises can occur. Moreover, as complexity increases, the more likely it becomes that a crisis in one aspect of the system will cause cascading crises in other parts of the system. So, suppose for sake of argument that a dissipative structure doesn't run out of fuel and isn't adversely impacted by any externalities. Can it go on indefinitely? In general, no. Because dissipative structures are never static, and they never go backwards. No natural process is reversible in itself, because entropy always increases, never spontaneously decreases. The same processes that bring a dissipative structure into being must continue, because energy must continue to flow, introducing new complexities. Each increase in complexity has a metabolic cost, that is, a maintenance cost, that also continues. As these costs accumulate, eventually the system becomes unsustainable on its energy base and increasingly fragile. And at some point, a crisis occurs, and there's a complexity collapse. If exergy is still available post-collapse, then it will arise anew, typically with significant variations from the old structure. The biologist Eugene Odum, who wrote the first American textbook on ecology, described how this process occurs in ecosystems. He termed it succession, and it's defined by three properties. It's an orderly process of community development. It results from modification of the physical environment by the community. And it culminates in a homeostatic ecosystem in which maximum biomass and symbiotic function between organisms are maintained. Maximum, that is, per unit of energy flow. Nature always optimizes. To repeat, self-organization is directed towards achieving as large and diverse an organic structure as possible within the limits set by the available energy input and the prevailing physical conditions. Once homeostasis is achieved, the ecosystem is mature. However, eventually the ecosystem succumbs to its own fragility. A small perturbation in climate, or a fire, or the evolution of a disruptive or invasive or parasitic species, and all the intricate specializations that led to optimization of the ecosystem structure become, in turn, the cause of the system's failure. In the long view, this is not a tragedy, but an essential component of the evolutionary process. It's precisely the story of life on this planet, with its breathtaking diversity not only across continents, but across time. Notice that in Odum's succession, no organism controls or directs the ecosystem's development. Each organism behaves in accordance with its own nature, affecting and affected by the other organisms, yet the result is a tightly integrated system in which each organism depends for its own existence on the system as a whole. When the system fails, the individual organisms mostly die. All right, so that's a lot of analogies. What about civilization as dissipative structures? Humans had no civilization until about 20,000 years ago, despite having a rich trove of cultural artifacts dating back at least 50,000 years. Hunter-gatherers have to spend nearly all their energy, everything they can acquire from their environment, on acquiring that very energy. Most animals, prehistoric humans included, spend most of the energy they get from food on the task of acquiring more food. The ratio of the totality of energy acquired to the energy cost of acquiring that energy is called EROI, for energy return on investment. For living things, it's generally always between 1 and 2. That is, the energy they must spend getting energy is not a lot more than the energy they get. Less than 1 means starvation. Closer to 2 means further growth and development is possible, since there's excess energy available for it. The EROI on hunting-gathering is between 1 and 2, just high enough to permit maintenance of a kinship group, reproduction, and the fashioning of a few implements and decorations. The cultural sophistication can be impressive, but the level of social complexity is essentially zero. There's only enough excess energy for the complexity shown here. No intermediate levels of authority between the lowest and the highest ranked members, very little specialization, and only limited forms of interaction with other groups. It wasn't until around 12,000 years ago, when humans first started to domesticate both animals and plants, that their EROI increased sufficiently to allow a burst in social complexity. Population sizes also expanded. In fact, population seems to always closely track energy return on investment. Agricultural communities were able to store and process food in greater quantities, creating enough excess energy that some could be spent on dwellings, complex tools, and increasing specialization, including roles not directly involved in food production, that is to say, in energy acquisition. As farming techniques improved and more productive breeds and plants and animals were cultivated, the ROI rose as high as 4 or so. Not only were all the present needs met with plenty to spare, but embodied energy in the form of preserved food and tradable goods could be accumulated. This development introduced 2 new wrinkles. First, it was very common for a community to overexploit an agricultural area, resulting in reduced yields over time, what's called diminishing returns, and that results in a reduced EROI. Second, successful communities were an inviting target for raiders. These features play a significant role in the next leap in complexity, from agricultural communities to agriculture-based empires. Ancient empires were built on centralized control of agricultural regions, control that was acquired through conquest. When one society conquers another, the conqueror gets a huge boost to their energy return on investment, because the accumulated wealth of the conquered society, its excess food and goods, can be pillaged outright. And if the conquered remain conquered, they can be taxed. In this way, the ancient empires often grew quite large, and some lasted for many centuries or more. With their excess energy, empires grew socially very complex, with administrative, military, religious, and economic sectors, each with its own hierarchy and technicians. The number of intermediaries between the lowest and highest ranked members of society was large, and the number of social roles exploded. In addition to trading and war, relations between societies could be diplomatic and involve cultural exchange. However, every ancient empire suffered a similar fate. Once the surrounding societies are conquered and pillaged, they have to be administered and garrisoned. That soaks up a lot of excess energy. Each new campaign stretches lines of supply and control farther than before. Diminishing returns set in, and the EROI declines. To compensate for the loss of energy while maintaining homeostasis, taxes are increased, typically in the form of an ever greater share of agricultural output from vassals. This leads inexorably to resource depletion, and finally, the weakened empire is itself conquered, or simply falls to pieces. The case of Rome. Rome is especially instructive. They were very, very good at being an empire, and were able to hold off collapse for a long time. But ultimately, every step they took to avoid collapse ensured that when the collapse occurred, it would be complete. Rome squeezed its agricultural and human resource base for every drop of energy, with the result that when the Western Empire finally collapsed in the face of determined attacks from the frontier, the drop in social complexity, in population, and in political and cultural stability was extreme and lasted for nearly 500 years. We call it the Dark Ages, right? There was no resource base left in the form of fertile soil, harvestable forests, and stable human communities from which to rebuild. Okay, so further developments in energy capture were pretty limited before the Industrial Age. There were innovations like the capture of mechanical wind power, enabling, for instance, the flourishing of the Dutch Empire in the 16th century, and other seagoing empires. But nothing that increased EROI much above 5 or so. But with the invention of the heat engine in the 18th century, and of fossil fuels to produce the heat, everything changed. Coal and later oil provided an energy return on investment of up to 100. 1 unit of energy in, 100 units of energy out, making almost limitless energy available to drive social development of every kind. Global per capita energy use rose exponentially, quadrupling by the year 2000, even as the global population increased by more than sevenfold. The result is what we have today. A globalized, industrialized, fully integrated economy with massive energy and information flows, in which the level of connectivity within and between groups is so high that the complexity rivals anything previously imagined or imaginable. To put our per capita energy use in expensive, consider that a healthy adult can sustain about 75 watts of work for 8 hours, an 8-hour day. That's about 600 watt-hours of work, 0.6 of a kilowatt. If you had 10 slaves, they could perform 6 kilowatt-hours of work for you in a workday. Rather less than you get from a single gallon of gasoline used in a typical car engine. A gallon of gasoline can propel an automobile 30 miles in 30 minutes. How long would it take you to push your car 30 miles? How many friends would you need to help you? An average American consumer, directly and indirectly, uses enough energy daily to perform the work of hundreds of slaves. These energy slaves are what make global industrial civilization possible. It's an almost universal conceit, that our present level of social complexity is largely owing to our cleverness. Right? It's because we're clever. But the accumulation of technical and theoretical knowledge, up to the 18th century, that certainly was important. It was a fundamental ingredient in what came after. But the explosion of economic and population growth, technical advancement, and social complexity from 1800 to the present could not have occurred without the huge excess energy that fossil fuels provided. With an early return on investment of 50 to 100, that energy permitted the overwhelming majority of the population to redirect their activity away from agriculture and energy acquisition to an ever-expanding array of other social specialties. And this in turn accelerated further innovation by orders of magnitude. Now, however, as you're probably aware, we face some challenges. First of all, our civilization is designed for very high energy flows. And the quantity of fossil fuel remaining on Earth is declining. The less fossil fuel that remains, the more it costs to exploit it. There are no substitutable energy sources that have a similar energy return on investment. I'll unpack substitutable here in just a few minutes. Our non-energy resource base, minerals, water, arable land, and so on, is also dwindling. And the ecological basis of any future low energy return on investment civilization is being destroyed. In short, we're falling off what's been termed the energy cliff. An energy return on investment of 100 means that 99% of the 99% of the energy accumulated can be diverted to uses other than getting more energy. The ROI of 20 means that 95% is available for use, so there isn't much practical difference between an energy return on investment of 100 and an ROI of 20. But after that, things get worse very quickly. And an energy return on investment of 5 means that only 80% of the energy is available for other uses. When oil was first exploited as a fuel source, the ROI was roughly 100. As the oil economy grew, both institutional and physical infrastructures had to be built for it. For example, paved roads. And these metabolic costs decreased the energy return on investment to 30 or so. As the richest and easiest to exploit deposits were exhausted, more had to be spent to exploit deposits that were smaller and harder to reach and of lower quality. By the start of the 21st century, the average energy return on investment, it's hard to say that over and over, isn't it, of conventional oil had dropped to 20. And the energy return on investment of newly exploited deposits of conventional oil is now 10 or less. Wind and solar are now competitive with oil at the point of generation. But if the electricity they produce has to be stored, the EROI drops to barely more than 1. Unconventional oil sources have an EROI of no more than 5, possibly much less. And the pace of diminishing returns is much quicker for those than with conventional oil. Biomass has turned out to be a bust from an EROI perspective, and agricultural land is becoming far too precious to waste on it. The difference between an EROI of 20 and one of 5 is more significant than it might appear. Established economies have a metabolic cost. Existing infrastructure has to be serviced and replaced. Existing institutions have to be funded. Existing populations have to be fed and clothed and housed and transported. A decline of 5% can mean the difference between meeting these costs with enough left over for further development or not meeting these costs, which means the civilization must cannibalize its reserves, and fragility and eventually collapse ensues. So how might we avoid falling off the energy cliff? So here are some ideas that people have, right? We could just start exploiting the existing energy resources at a faster rate, right? Because, if you're only getting 80% back, then exploit that much more to make up the difference. You could try to use the existing resources more efficiently. Or maybe you can make the existing economic and social orders less energy intensive, so they need less energy. And of course, you want to try to find new energy sources to replace the existing ones. Unfortunately, what we're going to see here is that none of these options is actually available. Consider exploiting fossil energy at a faster rate. So, conventional oil and gas production peaked globally about 10 years ago. In the United States, it peaked about 40 years ago. And it can't be economically increased because the cost of expanding the drilling and refining infrastructure to increase throughput can never be recovered by the value of the remaining oil. We could increase coal, but only at severe environmental cost, even before climate change is considered. And that supply too will peak before very long. Shale oil recovered through fracking already has too low an EROI to make it profitable to extract. This is kind of an open secret in the financial press. I don't know if you've been following, but there's a $250 billion investment in oil shale and gas fracking pipelines are being built for. None of these companies has ever made any money. It's a huge debt bubble. Anyway, and they have a devastating ecological cost, of course. Continuing to release greenhouse gases at our present rate, let alone an accelerating rate, puts the planet on track to cross climate tipping points, possibly within a decade, that will probably result in near-term global extinction of most life, including us. And carbon capture and sequestration technology and so-called negative emissions technologies, not only are they unproven, but they'll reduce the energy return on investment to 1 or less if we implement them on a wide scale. Okay? What about increasing efficiency? Well, we've already dramatically increased efficiency, right? Buildings are better insulated, lighting and other appliances are more efficient. We're all switching to LEDs. Gas and diesel engines are much more efficient. I have a truck, it gets 20 miles per gallon on the highway. Don't worry, I don't drive it much. But the one that I had, I should say that my dad had many years ago, that got 12 miles to the gallon, so that's a big improvement. But for every efficiency introduced, the rate of consumption has increased, not decreased. This is called the Jevons paradox, and it's an observable feature of natural economies. In the absence of forced rationing, efficiency always increases rather than decreases the rate of consumption. Also, increasing efficiency requires the development of new technologies, new kinds of motors and devices, new lighting technologies, and so on. New technologies require research and prototyping and then capitalization in the marketplace, and each of these steps demands an energy budget. And there are diminishing returns on innovation, so that each new increment of technical progress requires more energy on average than the ones that came before. And the rate of increase is exponential. I mean, think about the inventors in the early 20th century, Edison and Tesla and so on and so forth. They were grabbing the low-hanging fruit, right? If you look at the, back in the records, this is something that Tainter did when he did his business on the collapse of complex societies. Look back in the patent office records, and you'll see that there were a lot of patents given to individual inventors, individual researchers. That almost never happens anymore because those easy-to-get innovations have been gotten. Not only has the rate of new patents slowed down, but the size of the teams and their budget that get those new patents has exploded. It takes a well-researched department of a dozen people to come close to finding a new patentable technology. So that's diminishing returns. What about making the existing economic and social orders less energy intensive? Well, as we noted, efficiency isn't going to do it. And really, we can't achieve much beyond the efficiency we've already achieved. More people could insulate their homes, but that's about as good as it gets. Consequently, the only way to make the economy use less energy is to unwind its complexity. And this is impossible to do in a deliberate fashion. I'll explore the reasons why after dealing with alternative energy sources. So here they are. There's actually only 4 primary sources of energy on Earth: solar, tidal, nuclear, and geothermal. Fossil fuel isn't an energy source. Fossil fuel is an energy carrier. Basically a big battery that the sun charged up over hundreds of millions of years and which we've now drained. The battery can be recharged, but only on geological timescales. So for human purposes, once we've drained it, that's it. Geothermal energy has not been exploited up to now in any meaningful way because the engineering challenges are too great to make it economical. Tidal energy, which is caused by the relative motions of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, and Albert Einstein, has likewise not been exploited for the same reasons. Nuclear energy, in principle, is ideal. The old thing about, in theory there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. It produces almost unlimited electricity at what ought to be manageable cost, but it hasn't turned out that way. Because of the cost of building and decommissioning fission nuclear plants, and because of the enormous risks they represent, no nuclear plant has ever stood on its own economically. It has always had to rely on subsidies, especially indemnities. And inevitably the disasters occur. Few nations are pursuing this option anymore, and most plants will go out of commission within a few decades, hopefully in a controlled manner. Nuclear fusion wouldn't have many of these problems, but that technology has been feasible in just a few years since I was in high school 40 years ago. I wouldn't hold my breath.